Welcome to this week's video tutorial with Virtual Racing School for the iRacing Blancpain series. This time we visit the undulating and awkward challenge of Barber Motorsports Park, a circuit which finally allows the BMW Z4 to flourish and should be very strong here. The lap I've driven is as usual in default weather on race fuel with late afternoon time of day to match the schedule. Okay, so we'll play the lap through in full before then going into further analysis. Okay, so that was a 1 minute 19.895. Okay, so as ever from the list of data packs on the VRS website, we're going to choose the BMW data pack this time, as driven by myself, and we're going to choose week 6 from the list. Loads up the session details, where you can download lap files, a replay and the setup, and we're just going to click on Learn Track, which will load up the analyzer. It will start to play the lap through. I'm just going to pause it and I'll slow it down and mute it for the purpose of this tutorial. So for any of you who might be unfamiliar with what we're seeing, we've got a variety of different telemetry channels. So we've got a steering trace across the duration of the lap. We've got a speed trace, brake and throttle input traces, and some live inputs on the bottom left. So I'm going to take it to sector 1, which is the run from the start finish line to the braking point for turn 1. Now at Barber the start finish line is very late on the straight, so there's not really much of a amount of time before the lap begins before you start braking. So as we play it through here, you need to obviously be thinking about your braking point already, which is going to be just after the 2 marker for me. So take it through to sector 2. So we can see that obviously this is a very high speed first corner, and I reach peak brake pressure, yeah, pretty much in between the 2 and the 1, maybe a little bit closer to the 1. But obviously car positioning, you want to be right at the edge of the circuit. The apex is of course blind, as is the case for many corners at Barber. So turn-in reference is going to be just before this curb on the right and shortly after the 1 marker, and then as you turn in you'll be gradually bleeding off those brakes. Now I'm just going to pause it there because you'll notice that I breathe into the throttle ever so slightly, and what I'm doing there is just unloading the front tyres to push the car on a slightly wider line. Now obviously at this point I can actually finally see the apex, so often, obviously you're guessing here, often you'll turn in a fraction too soon, and you can counter that by just breathing in the throttle. So as I play it through, obviously at this point the ideal line at the apex is going to be just off the curb, but you do want to get as close to it as possible, like I've done, maybe just a tiny little bit further away. And ideally picking up the throttle really quite hard at the apex. The car will compress at the bottom of the hill, so you get a decent amount of room to really commit. Obviously you don't want to end up on the grass on the exit there, so it's okay to get close to it, but I'm essentially committing to full throttle, knowing that the car is going to grip up slightly as the car compresses down the hill, but obviously you don't want to carry too much apex speed, and that's why it's important to continue braking all the way into the apex. So you see that as I breathed into the throttle, I then got back on the brakes again just to retighten the car, just to get that last little bit of rotation before then committing hard to the throttle for the exit. Up the hill now, bring the car over to the left a little bit. You've got these seams on the tarmac throughout the circuit, and ideally you want to bring the car just slightly over to the left. Sorry, we'll go to sector 3 for that. And as you're going up the hill, you want to briefly hit the brakes before turning right. Briefly in 4th gear there as well. Back down to 3rd for the right-hander, and this is a painfully long right-hander where it feels like the front end just never has enough grip. So the way that you sort of overcome that is to never completely let go of the brake. So you'll notice how I'm holding on those brakes all the way into the point at which I get hard on the throttle. So if we just go back a tiny bit, I just want to show you the first of 2 apexes for this corner. So you've got your first apex just here, and then as we play it through, the car will go ever so slightly wider. That's okay. And then sort of in the middle of the corner is where I pick up the throttle. Now I'm only doing this in anticipation that the car is going to rotate enough to be able to apex again. That's really important. You don't want to miss that second apex, because that's going to allow you to exit with a decent amount of speed and have a decent amount of room on the exit to really commit. So I'm trying to commit to the throttle as early as possible, and you'll notice in terms of how the shape of my application, I'm really stabbing at the throttle there, and that's to try and get right on the edge of grip and help the car rotate. So when you're on the limit of grip from the rear tyres, you'll feel the car rotate better. So let me just play that through. So I'm stabbing at the throttle, trying to get the car to rotate. Now it's rotating, and I'll pause it there and show you that I sort of just about reached the second apex. So you don't need to be spot on, as long as you bring it back nice and tight for the exit and you have enough room to run all the way to the exit curb without running too wide onto the grass. And obviously the car will be quite understeery there, so you need to be aware of overworking the front tyres with too much steering lock. So as soon as you're in this position, you want to be opening the steering up again, and just carrying a nice smooth path up the hill. You've got another apex here on the right. Get close to that curb there, but don't actually make contact with it, and then take a nice sweeping wide path towards the braking zone into the hairpin of turn 5. Now my braking marker for this corner is going to be the number 2 marker just before there, and this is probably the hardest braking zone on the whole circuit. So I can brake hard in a straight line, 90% pressure there, really slowing the car down in a straight line, getting the speed down all the way into 2nd gear, and then I start to turn in roughly halfway along the curb. Now I do believe I was probably a tiny bit early on the brakes here, and the reason I say that is because the car was just on slightly too tight a line on entry. Now I really didn't want to hit this curb here on the entry, so it just meant that I had to come off the brakes a little bit more to carry speed in to try and compromise. But it was still a good line. The only thing is, this is another double apex corner essentially, so you've got this second curb and you want to pick up the throttle. Generally in a double apex corner you want to pick up the throttle in between the 2 corners when the car is at its widest point, and it's just in that transient period between tightening up again. So I do that, I pick up the throttle nice and hard. Obviously we are in 2nd gear at this point, so we're more traction limited, which is why it takes me longer to really commit to full throttle. and then I open the car up a bit more than would be optimal, so I'm a little bit further away from this apex as is probably ideal, but overall it's still quite good because there's plenty of room on the exit to take advantage. So I do actually exit with a decent amount of speed, even though I cover slightly more distance on that slightly wider line. So into probably the most awkward corner on the circuit, and one of the most awkward corners I think in all of iRacing. Now the braking point into this awkward downhill chicane slash hairpin is going to be between the 2 and the 1 marker, and there's pretty much 2 braking zones here, and neither one allows you to brake super hard because you're having to turn in whilst braking, or you're either on a curb, so it's just very awkward. So I brake in between the 2 and the 1, and initially I pretty much immediately I start bleeding off because the car tends to get oversteery as I'm turning in, and that's why you can see in the steering trace I'm just making some minor corrections with the wheel. And then in terms of car positioning, I want to get really close to this first curb but try and avoid making contact with it. It's quite a tall curb, as are most at this circuit, so you want to get close but don't make contact with it. And then in between there is a brief area where you can get back on the power, if anything just to stabilize the car. So this is probably the point where the car is most likely to oversteer. So I get back into the throttle, and that just stabilizes the car before I get back into the brakes again. And the car is on the right path to pretty much directly run over this curb on the left on the entry, which you can do in this car. It'll allow you to take all of that curb. Obviously you can't afford to brake too hard on there, but the most important thing is to keep the steering really straight. So you want to set the positioning of the car up perfectly before you get onto this curb, so you can brake in a straight line as you go over it, and that way the car won't get unsettled. So then I'm braking quite deep, the corner falls away down the hill, and I really want to rotate the car in the middle of the corner, which is why I wait quite a long time before getting back on the power. If I got on the power too soon, the car wouldn't have rotated enough. So that's also why I'm holding the brakes for quite a long time. And if we go back just a tiny bit, you can also see that I do run the inside of the curb. Now that's not, I would say, perfect. You want to get as close to that as possible, but again, because it's a tall curb, it's actually best if you avoid it. But fortunately this car is quite compliant, and I'm able to commit to full throttle nice and early, using all of the track on the exit only if necessary, and then bringing the car over to the right hand side towards this entry curb into this high speed chicane, where I'm turning in completely flat out and I'm aiming for this first curb. So you'll see the car is fully on that curb, and you'll also see at that moment I'm also upshifting into 5th, and I've breathed out of the throttle because I'm anticipating that that curb will upset the car slightly. And then in between the 2 corners, so into the right-hander, I have a full lift. Now this second curb, you want to get close to it, but you don't want to make contact with it ideally. So I just miss it a tiny bit, probably could have been slightly further over to the right. This corner's so much about timing and getting your line spot on, and if you've done that, you'll be able to commit to the throttle just before you apex, which I've tried to do there. And at this point you're just hoping and crossing your fingers that you're not going to run out of track, and fortunately that's okay. Right next to the grass, but it's okay. I've not had to lift, which is good. And then towards the very spectacular downhill, uphill, fast sweeping chicane that is 12 and 13. Going to be braking here just before the 1 marker, with the car fully positioned over to the right hand side, and this is very tricky on entry because it's completely blind. So again, this is another place where after I immediately brake, I'm playing with the throttle just to unload the front tyres to stop the car rotating too much on the entry. Now the line has turned out to be just right at the apex. Now you can actually use this inside curb, but I opt to avoid it just because it's very risky, and a few times it's unsettled the car and actually made me slower overall. So down the hill you can get back into the throttle, and then as you sort of get towards the bottom of the hill, you need to set the car up for the right-hander. So I take the opportunity to get back into the brakes quite firmly but briefly, and then I don't let go of the brakes. I hold the brakes to keep the front end loaded up, negate any understeer, keep the car rotating, and that allows me to hook up onto this curb up the hill and also pick up the throttle quite firmly up the hill as well. And then obviously at this point you are once again blind for the exit, and the circuit obviously crests and the car goes really light, so bad idea to commit to too much throttle here, which is why I'm being patient and modulating that throttle, just hoping that I don't run out wide onto the grass as well at this point, which I do just about there, which does upset the car ever so slightly. And we'll see in sector 8 that I make a very, very brief nervous correction to the wheel, hoping that it's not going to be worse, and I also breathe out of the throttle briefly as well, just to keep the car, just to keep things from escalating and losing control. And so down the hill now in towards turn 14, and approaching the very, very understeery right-hander back up the hill again. Aiming for this curb at the bottom, using all of that curb. It's a very, very wide flat curb, so you can really get the car, all four wheels, onto there. And then in terms of car positioning, so steering wise you want to be turning in throughout this whole sequence, but it's tight on entry, and then in the middle it opens up, and then into turn 15 it tightens again. But the whole time you want to be sort of on the limit of grip whilst doing this. So I brake initially as the circuit tightens up, and then I come off the brakes just about here to take advantage of the fact that the track is opening up. And in terms of positioning, there's two seams in the tarmac. The one on the left, I would say you don't want to run too much wider than that, so don't let the car run too much wider than that. And then back in the brakes, never really braking very hard. This is mostly just to rotate the car. So I'm stabilizing the car with the throttle, rotating the car with the brakes, just basically steering the car with the pedals. That's basically what I'm doing. And then turn 16, I do actually just miss the apex here, but it's okay, get away with it. But it does mean I have to hesitate slightly in reaching full throttle, and then bring the car back over to the right hand side, turning in finally into the last corner, roughly halfway along the curb on the right. Now I did have a slightly narrower entry as a result of missing the previous apex, but it's really quite minor. So we'll take it to sector 9 for the last corner, and again just teasing the brakes here on entry just to rotate the car. I'm still in third gear, and then I pick up the throttle really hard just before the apex, and the corner starts to open up again, and brief hesitation before full throttle because I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. Fortunately I've got the grip and I've got enough track available on the exit to keep that commitment all the way out towards the start finish line. You can find qualifying and race setups, telemetry and replays over at virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book one-on-one tuition with myself and top drivers from the likes of Koala Simsport. Good luck for this week, and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.